Arizona PBS is proud to support Indian Country Today. For 6 decades, we've provided television programs and now digital content. But we go beyond that, sending outreach teams across Arizona, offering workshops in language and literacy, family engagement and community outreach, and supporting tribal communities with early learning and school readiness resources. Join us at azpbs.org.
This is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, Yese'e. Thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalohungva. The U.S. Department of Energy is funding 13 American Indian and Alaska Native communities for projects that will help them reduce carbon emissions. DOE is allocating $12 million for projects that reduce energy costs and increase energy security and resiliency on tribal lands. These selected projects all include critical elements to reaching the Biden administration's goal of net zero carbon emission by 2050. Some of the work includes powering homes, making buildings more energy efficient, and installing microgrids for essential services. Walea Johns is the Special Advisor for the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs at the DOE.
These kind of clean energy values are in line with who we are as Indigenous people, the caretaking of Mother Earth and Father Sky of nature. And it speaks a lot to kind of the priorities and the policy that's being developed today. And we do need the guidance of Native American people.
It's estimated the projects will save those tribal communities a combined $1.8 million annually. A new podcast is using Indigenous voices to explore the creation of U.S. national parks. It's called Parks and shares the history of tribes who lived in the areas that became national parks. The Santa Fe New Mexican.com reports it also shows how land was taken from tribes and other issues Indigenous communities face. Shane Doyle was the podcast's first guest. He's a Crow citizen and founding member of Native Nexus, which creates American Indian curriculum for educators. In 1872, Doyle's ancestors were forcibly removed from lands that became Yellowstone National Park, the world's first national park. Nearly 30 other tribes were also displaced when Yellowstone was created. The second episode features the Grand Canyon and how the Hopi, Wallapai, and Paiute, along with several other tribes, were pushed out of the canyon when that park was established. You can listen to all of the episodes on the website parkspodcast.com. Inuit people in Canada are creating a strategy to tackle food insecurity in their communities. APTN reports the Inuit Nanangat Food Security Strategy shows 76% of Inuit 15 years and older experience food insecurity. The plan lays out Inuit-driven solutions to be supported by all levels of government to create sustainable food systems. The document is also meant to educate Canadians living outside of Inuit communities about the ongoing food security crisis. The president of the Inuit organization is Nathan Obed. He says many in the cabinet are aware of the issue and hopes the government will fund the strategy. Well, there's a lot of history in Ashley Barty's Wimbledon championship. She's only the second Indigenous Australian to win the title. The last one was 50 years ago. And Barty beat Karolina Pliskova in the first women's singles final to go to a third set since 2012. This is the second Grand Slam title for the 25-year-old champ. Barty is Wurundjeri. The last Indigenous woman to win Wimbledon was Gulagong Kali, who is Naragu. Going into the finals, Barty was the favorite to win, and the opening minutes of the match made a Barty championship seem like a lock. NITV reports her parents had no clue their youngest child would become a French Open and Wimbledon champion and the world's #1 player. Barty addressed the center court crowd wearing a version of the scallop dress that Kali wore back in 1971.
It took me a long time to verbalise the fact that I wanted to dare to dream it and say I wanted to win this incredible tournament, and being able to live out my dream right now with everyone here. This has made it better than I ever could have imagined. I didn't sleep a lot last night. I was thinking of all the what ifs, but I think when I was able to coming out on this court, I felt at home in a way, and I think being able to share that with everyone here, to share that with my team is incredible.
The champion now becomes the top earning Australian tennis player in history, male or female. Congratulations. Well, the Morongo Band of Mission Indians in Southern California is now an owner of a power grid. Former band chairman Robert Martin says ownership of utility lines could be a new model for tribes. The band's new company, Morongo Transmission, is investing in a $740 million transmission line project that cuts across tribal lands. To read more, visit IndianCountryToday.com and search for the headline, Paradigm Shift, Tribe is now an owner of the power grid. And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today. I'm Patty Thalahongva. What are some of the differences between boarding schools for Indigenous children in the U.S. and Canada? We'll find out later in our newscast.
But first, a conversation about recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic with Acoma Pueblo Governor Brian Vallo. There are 19 pueblos in the state of New Mexico. In the western part of the state is the Pueblo of Acoma. In 2019, Brian Vallo was appointed governor of Acoma Pueblo. Before that, he served as director of the Indian Arts Research Center at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe. He joins us now to talk about COVID recovery and the latest happenings in Acoma. Welcome, Governor Vallo.
Good morning.
Let's start with kind of the big picture, how the Pueblo fared during the pandemic.
Well, it was quite an experience for all of us. I will have to say that I'm really grateful for the tribal community for really sticking together and following the rules. It was a great sacrifice on the part of the entire community to ensure that we were all safe. We were impacted in a big way for our population. We have about 5,100 tribal members. About 3,700 of those tribal members live on the reservation, and a total of about 450 tribal members did contract the COVID virus. And unfortunately, we did lose 23 tribal members. So it took its toll, and of course, with our executive order and stay-at-home restrictions, it prohibited us from being community, and really being Acoma people, and in terms of our engagement with culture and our own life way. But I'm really grateful that we've reached herd immunity. We about a month and a half ago, and we have not had any positive COVID cases for nearly 4 months now.
Oh, that's wonderful. How did the recovery process unfold? Were people ready to get the vaccinations and started getting them in regular order?
Yeah, I believe that, and it was really interesting. We had a large percentage of our elders who were eager to receive the vaccine. And many of those individuals came out on the first day that we hosted a vaccination clinic. Many of them were also veterans of our community. And we did prioritize this age group, our elders and cultural leaders, as the first group of tribal members who would have access to the vaccine. And so that first vaccination clinic took place in mid-December. And, it took a while for us to bring in the larger majority of the community, but it was really those elders who really set a good example and really set the stage for the success then of vaccination here at the Pueblo.
Like a lot of pueblos and tribes, you have a pretty robust economic development program, including Sky City. Maybe talk about where you stand with the enterprises.
Yeah, thank you for that question. This is it's been tough for us. We are located right off the Interstate 40. Our casino and 2 travel centers are located along this corridor. And so it was with great caution that we and our business board of the corporation monitored what was happening with the pandemic to determine the right time for reopening our operations. And the first to open was the travel center, and then eventually the second travel center. And they operated at about 50% for nearly 4 months. And about 4 months later, then we opened the travel casino, and that operation, was only at 50% up until just about a week and a half ago. And we have very stringent guidelines for our clients who are coming into our enterprises, our hotel and our restaurants, also located along Interstate 40. We also have some businesses in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so we have been operating those entities under the state guidelines. So, we're making some progress, but we're still very cautious. And just like anyone else, we are challenged with the employee resource. Many have chosen not to return to work. And so we've been engaged in career fairs and other initiatives to hire additional staff for all of our tribal entities. The only tribal operation that has not yet reopened is our Sky City Cultural Center and Agu Museum. And it's unknown at this point just when that might reopen. But we're hopeful that perhaps even later this year, they will have the opportunity to reopen and re-engage in tourism activity. And some of you might know that this center and museum is located right below the old village at the Pueblo, which has been closed and restricted only to cultural leaders up until just recently.
Governor, are you finding both with tribal citizens and with your neighbors that there's a pent-up demand to get out and do things?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We've all been penned up for quite some time. Many of our tribal members, and on our executive order, children were restricted from leaving the Pueblo, as were elders, up until earlier this year. And just 2 weeks ago, the executive order was amended to allow children to leave for the first time. So it was a big deal for us, and families were eager to get out and just spend time together. This was also the first time that tribal members who live off the reservation had access to enter tribal lands. So families have been re-engaging. It's been very beautiful to see this happening. We had a welcome home of sorts event this past Saturday, and it was for the first time as tribal leaders, we saw our community members who we hadn't seen since the beginning of the pandemic. So there certainly is a great anticipation, but again, I'm really grateful that our community members are being very cautious. Our tribal community remains closed and restricted. We maintain a checkpoint at a security station to manage everyone who is coming on and off the reservation.
Governor, I want to ask you about another controversy, and that is during the middle of the pandemic, the Indian Health Service decided to close the hospital. Where are we with that?
Well, I wish that I could say there has been some good progress made. Unfortunately, even with a federal court ruling the Indian Health Service has been very lax in its response then to that court order. The ACL hospital is in operation, thank goodness, and it will maintain its current operation through February of next year. And so what we have been engaged in our conversations with the headquarters of the Indian Health Service, and soon, I hope, a more robust engagement with Albuquerque Area Indian Health Service and the new CEO who has finally been hired for the ACL service unit to work with the Pueblo and its newly formed health board to really look at healthcare for the Pueblo holistically, and to determine how and to what extent the Pueblo or the ACL hospital will play a role in this new healthcare system for the Pueblo of Acoma.
Does Congress have to fund it directly?
We are hopeful that Congress will make an appropriation to support the operation of ACL for at least another 2 to 3 years following the February deadline.
Thank you so much, Governor.
Thank you.
Popular travel destinations like Hawaii saw massive declines of tourists last year due to COVID. Now the islands have opened back up, and Native Hawaiians say they are feeling the effects of tourists on their homelands. Reporter Aaliyah Chavez has more.
A woman illegally touching an endangered monk seal, tourists hopping fences to take a photo, or people gathering sand from beaches to take home with them. Tourism in Hawaii is back, and more Native Hawaiians say they are witnessing dangerous and disrespectful behavior. In 2019, a year before COVID hit, authorities say 10.4 million people visited the Hawaiian Islands, a record-breaking number. When COVID happened, that changed dramatically while travel restrictions were very strict. Less tourists meant Native Hawaiians were able to see clear ocean waters that weren't filled with sunscreen, and even fish and dolphins in places they hadn't seen in a long time.
Like all the oceans started to flourish, so it made the local community realize how much the island needed to rest itself.
The state lessened its restrictions a few months ago to allow tourists back. Since then, Kaniela Ng, a community organizer from the island of Maui, says the quality of life for residents has decreased with the uptick of visitors.
So our water is actually being diverted to fill the pools, to keep the pools filled and make sure the tourists are happy, while local residents can't even water their lawns or wash their cars.
In June, the mayor of Maui County even asked the airlines to pause in bringing tourists to the island.
Hawaii residents shouldn't feel like second-class citizens on our islands. Like, we nurture the land, we pour out our labor, we provide for our communities, and we're worth more than our ability to serve and perform and be extracted from for this tourism economy.
Tourism brings more than $45 million in revenue to Hawaii and supports more than 217,000 jobs, according to state data. Even the Hawaii Tourism Authority, the state agency responsible for managing tourism, says it is working to address the impacts of having so many visitors. The agency has created online reservation systems to help overcrowding at state parks and beaches. The agency is now asking visitors to use tour companies to enjoy scenic highways in Maui rather than booking rental cars because of traffic congestion, illegal parking, and pedestrian safety.
We've also increased fines by $200 for illegal parking, right? So we're saying, hey, your selfie isn't worth the risk of our community's health and safety. If an ambulance can't get into this community because you're parked on the side of a road and blocking the road, that's the impact you as a tourist getting a selfie is having on residents.
Rather than waiting for help from the state, some Native Hawaiians are taking to social media to address tourism directly. Daniel Aipa even created an infographic that went viral on Instagram to tell tourists to be respectful of sacred sites and to travel responsibly.
And that's the thing about Hawaii, is that we love to share our culture. Like, we love people coming to the islands to learn about who we are, what we're about. But at the same time, we hope that people respect our culture at the same time.
Reporting from Albuquerque, Aaliyah Chavez, Indian Country Today.
The Hawaii Tourism Authority says it's committed to ensuring that tourism in the future will provide economic benefits while ensuring a good quality of life for residents. The agency reorganized last month and now has Native Hawaiian leadership at the helm. We'll be right back. Canadian residential schools and now American boarding schools are in the news. The tragic history is well known to Native people, but so many Americans and Canadians have little knowledge about these programs designed to assimilate children. Marinette Pember is now working on a news story about the boarding school experience, and although there are many similarities between Indian residential school system in Canada and the Indian boarding school era in the States, there are also several differences. She is our national correspondent, and she joins us now. Welcome, Marinette.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Good. So let's start big picture. What's the main similarities and what's the main differences?
Well, of course, the main similarities, they were driven by the same philosophy, and that was to basically, open indigenous lands for white settlers to move into, and they came upon similar policies in which to accomplish that goal, and they came upon the idea of versus outright extinction. They chose to use these assimilationist policies, and that was to essentially separate Native people from their culture and their language in hopes of really kind of creating a class of servants to participate in the capitalist system, and I guess landless servants, if you will, and to no longer stand in the way of this westward expansion.
So you've mentioned that we're not surprised by any of the events, and every day, including today, new revelations come out about, particularly in Canada, about graves that were unmarked and unrecorded. How should people put this story into context?
Well, the boarding school era began, I guess, really kind of officially in 1819, and then really took hold later with Ulysses S. Grant's peace policy in the late, just after the Civil War, and continued into, really into the 20th century. But I would say really the heyday was lasted up into the 30s. So there were a lot of schools during that period. Now, they didn't all run concurrently. The number we're not completely sure because we haven't we don't have that information here in the United States, but researchers estimate that there were as many as 400 schools. In addition to the federal schools, were many mission schools of various Christian denominations, but primarily it was the Catholics that also ran schools. Now, sort of interestingly, the Unitarian Church ran a couple of schools, but they only were in business for a couple of years. Now, during this time period, in the United States, transportation was not what it is today, obviously. Also, the knowledge that we have about fighting disease was, not what we have today. So, placing these children in these large groups in close proximity, in unhealthy conditions and feeding them poor food resulted in a lot of kids dying, and catching communicable diseases. Now, that's just not counting, all of these kind of horror stories that many people in our communities share about kids essentially being beaten to death or freezing to death and they tried to run away. So it's likely that there are many, many burial grounds in places that we may be, obscured and have been sold, over the years, and people could be living atop some of these burial sites. Some of them could be small and some, could be quite large. I certainly predict that we're going to find, if we were to find all of the grave sites of Native kids in the United States that went to these residential schools, to these boarding schools, it will far exceed the number in Canada.
It's interesting, in Canada, they're starting to use high-tech detection techniques. Is that what's required in the United States?
Well, I think it will be something like that, certainly unless they just decide to exhume all of these sites. And it's expensive technology. Now in Canada, as part of the Indian Settlement Act, I think they allocated about $25 million to the bands. They refer to them as bands there rather than tribes mostly. So they have the money, at least, some big pot of money to accomplish this. Here, we don't have that, unless tribes take that on themselves and get grants. And some tribes have done that, I think, for various reasons to maybe accomplish looking at, former boarding school sites or for other, archaeological reasons and concerns that their citizens might have.
What sort of processes are going on? We have less than a minute left for healing.
Well, I think just the push for recognition that this happened here is a huge thing. And the National Native Boarding School Coalition has really pushed for that, and they have some grants to find the records, of the boarding schools and the children that attended. So I think just that aspect towards healing, is really important. And they're following somewhat of a template that the folks in Canada have done as well.
Marinette Pember, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news, go to IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Mark Trahant.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. This is Indian Country Today.